دنیا شده آماده یک جنگ جهانی دنیا شده آماده یک جنگ جهانی فریاد شیاطین جهان خوار یهودی بیرون زده از حنجره شاه سعود.
Welcome to Community Liberation Podcast, a podcast about applying revolutionary theory to revolutionary practice. My name is Sylvia, and I'm an organizer from Community Liberation Programs, or CLP. CLP is a multinational, scientific socialist mass organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We currently run decolonization programs in Oakland and San Francisco, such as our Oakland Chinatown Grocery Distribution and San Francisco Mission Youth Street Medic program. We also hold public political education events and classes. To learn more about our programs, you can follow us on Instagram at Community Liberation Programs and Twitter at ComLibPrograms. And you can support our Buy Me a Coffee and Give Butter in the show notes. This podcast and other decolonization programs for the people are 100% funded by grassroots donations like yours. So this is a special episode, episode 9, a Quds Day forum, Understanding the War on Iran, is a recording from our forum held on Quds Day, the last Friday of Ramadan this year. We had a cultural performance that isn't featured in this recording, but it was by Equipto, who is a San Francisco native organizer who is a part of the Frisco 5 hunger strike and has been organizing in the mission for decades. His information will be linked in the show notes. As for the forum, Syed Rafiq Ali provides historical and current context on the Islamic Republic of Iran and the current U.S./Zionist war in the region. This is a recording of the forum, so I want to apologize in advance for any background noise and audience questions that may be quieter than the speaker, but most of these questions were either repeated or inferred based on the answers. We also played some videos in person, so those will be provided in the show notes for translations from Farsi and Arabic, like the one that was played in the beginning of this recording. And it's also said in the recording, but I also wanted to emphasize that as a disclaimer, this is an educational event. CLP nor any of its organizers or guests support organizations which have been designated as foreign terrorist organizations by the government. We stand against imperialism and recognize our right to speak out against the illegal and immoral war on Iran and its population. Be aware this was a public event. All discussions from this event should be understood as educational and theoretical, with the intent of deepening our understanding of the situation in West Asia. So without further ado, please enjoy the forum put on by Syed Rafiq Ali.
And, today we're going to talk a lot about Iranian society, and we're providing like a counter narrative here. And, that's not to say like Iran is a utopia. There is no utopia on earth. Like all governments have like their own issues and contradictions and things that they struggle within their own populations. But the important thing here is like, we want to understand the movement. We want to understand the perspective of people in Iran. So that when a war happens like right now, and which will probably continue for some time, when aggression is happening against like countries that are the target of the United States and Israel, or the Zionist entity, I should say, it's important for us to have like a solid theoretical and historical grounding to build off of. So I encourage everybody to ask questions. I was mentioning some of the folks who are here a little early. There's no dumb questions. You can ask questions like, I've heard X, Y, Z. What do I say when people tell me that Iran has killed 100,000 protesters in 2 weeks? These types of questions are like acceptable. What we're not going to do today is like allow like we're not going to allow like disruption. You know what I'm saying? So approach it with like curiosity. If you're just here to like cause like a ruckus and disrupt, like there's so many Zionist rallies you can go to. You can go hang out with the Persians in San Jose or like in LA and Westwood. Like that's fine. There are spaces for you to do that. This is not the space. So approach it with curiosity. Like no one's going to come down on you for asking like a quote unquote like stupid question. As long as we're like here to learn and really like build our understanding of like what Iranian society and the Iranian state is. So legal disclaimer, I have to do this considering like how sensitive like what we're talking about is. CLP nor any of its organizers or guests who are coming to join us today or any of our events support organizations which have been designated by the US government as foreign terrorist organizations. We stand against imperialism and recognize our right to speak out against the illegal and immoral war on Iran and its civilian population. Be aware that this is a public event. We don't know everyone here. We can't control everyone who comes here. So all discussions today should be understood as educational and theoretical with the intent of deepening our understanding of the current situation in West Asia. The second thing is, under UN law, any nation which experiences aggression has a right to self-defense, and we recognize the Islamic Republic of Iran's right to self-defense. We also affirm the internationally recognized right of all indigenous peoples to resist occupation, which is especially relevant as we talk about Palestinian resistance. This is a UN internationally recognized. Yeah, we have extra mass there if you want. Cool. I think I talked about the schedule a little bit. We're going to take a break around iftar time. If there's any other Muslims here, like I'll be leading a prayer for Maghrib. We're going off Shia time, so apologies for any Sunnis in the audience. Doesn't mean you have to wait for me, but just a heads up, that's when I'll be doing it. So a little bit about myself. My name is Syed Rafiq Ali. I'm one of the co-founders of CLP, and I'm an Iranian, you might have guessed. And I think, like, you know, the perspective that you're going to hear today is a little different than what you might hear from a lot of Iranians you know in the U.S. What's up?
How far is the time? Like is it a couple minutes or?
For the prayer?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be at 7:26, I think, today.
And then how off? Or you said it's not the same time. Going on different.
Oh yeah. So it's like.
They gonna do it 5 minutes earlier, 5 minutes later, or?
So like Sunnis typically go to where like the last like disk of the sun is visible. Shias like go a little bit longer. We go until like you don't see like redness in the eastern sky. I think the difference ends up being like 12 minutes. Do you know? Like, sorry, I'm like looking at you because I thought you look like you might be Muslim, but I don't know if anybody else knows. Yeah. I'm racially profiling. It's okay. No. Yeah.
So yeah, it's about
15 minutes. Yeah. We like to have fun here. No. So yeah, a little bit about myself. Like, so I do go to Iran like pretty regularly. Oh, sorry. Let me finish answering your question. So there will be like a little 15-minute break. That's when we'll serve food. You guys are free to like kind of hang out a little bit, and then we'll start again like in a few minutes after that. So we'll make sure to announce all that. So a little bit about myself. Like, you know, I'm an Iranian. I travel back and forth to Iran. I was actually just there for a month back in May of last year, right before the 12-day war. I left about a week and a half before the bombs started dropping. And I spent 4 weeks in Iran. This was my first trip actually in a few years. Welcome. So I traveled most of the country. I visited like the holy shrine of Imam Reza that you guys can see there. Talked to all sorts of people around the country, really tried to get a feel for what was going on, tried to put any kind of preconceived notions I had aside, and to try to understand just from like my own experiences like what was actually happening in the country. Most of my family is still in Iran, actually, like the entirety of my mom's side of the family. My mother, who's actually like photographed here, she was young during the Islamic Revolution. So she was 12 years old when the revolution started. She lived through the Iran-Iraq War and then moved to the U.S. towards the end of the Iran-Iraq War. And you know, generally, like the reason I like bring this up and kind of show you guys these videos is like I think it's important to understand like this is not like a theoretical like conversation. This is a video of my grandma actually. Fun fact: she shares the exact same birth date as Ali Khamenei.
wow.
So the reason I mention this is like it's important to understand like this can be a really like emotionally touchy subject. We can be like the subject of like theoretical discussions. Like I've gotten into arguments on the street with like the RevCom folks who like are all anti-Iran and stuff, and like they've actually gotten into huge fights with like my sister and my mom. Like, and I think it's like easy to like feel detached from this. Like, oh, we're just talking about like people over there. Like it's not real people. Like Iran is such a beautiful and rich country, and I'm a little biased when I say it, but I think it's like the greatest country on earth. Like you're talking about thousands of years of history, like a deep culture of resistance, a deep like cultural like values of like love and compassion. And I think Islamophobia has such a way of demonizing like regular people. So it's important for us like when we like look at this thing, like we understand like Iran really is like you know, for us it's like a holy land, right? Like it's where like many of our Shia imams like actually one of them, Imam Reza, is like laid to rest. That's like the shrine that I'm at there with my uncle. This is like a picture, I promise this is not just me going through my vacation pictures. This is a picture of like me with like different people who are like custodians at the mosque. Like every night they, once a week, like each of these people goes and like serves, like cleans the mosque, like directs visitors and pilgrims from all over the world. And they were all actually students of my uncle who was a professor at like an agricultural engineering university in Sirjan, like in the southeast of Iran. So I just mentioned that because I want everyone to kind of like keep in mind, and actually like the really like sad thing here is like, there's a picture here on the bottom left, right here. You guys can see my mouse. It's called Kalkygordistan. It was a Qajar dynasty palace that was built in the 19th century. This was just bombed by the Zionist entity a few days ago, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I wish I could say it's the only UNESCO World Heritage Site that I went to on this last trip that has recently been bombed by the US and the Zionists, but that's not true. It's actually been 4 or 5 of them. The other thing I'll mention too is I think one thing as we approach this is we really have to try to cast aside as much of the Orientalist framing that we've been given by our media, by our culture, and understand there's a different sort of set of values at play here and how people are in their day-to-day lives. One thing I was just amazed by in Iran is the love and compassion and support shown to disabled people in Iran. So this picture is actually it's at a zurkhane, which is a traditional. I don't know if you guys ever seen the videos of the big clubs where they're doing it's traditional Persian bodybuilding basically. This was a zurkhane that catered specifically to young people with Down syndrome and other physical and mental disabilities. And so you see that all the time in Iran. I think some of you might have seen this recently on social media. The Zionists in the U.S. just bombed a cafe in Tehran that is run entirely by people with autism and Down syndrome. So it's important to understand it might not look the way we're used to seeing disability justice or gender justice or things look like. We need to try to approach it with the lens that casts aside that Orientalist framing a little bit. Okay, so what are our objectives today? And then, we've got a few minutes until iftar and Maghrib. So why are we here today? Open question. Why did you guys come today?
Understand what's going on in Iran.
Understand what's going on in Iran. Anyone else? Yeah, you guys showed up on pretty short notice. That's pretty awesome. Yeah.
Learn more about this organization.
Awesome. Learn more about CLP. Cool. What have you guys been told about the Islamic Republic? What have you heard about the Islamic Republic of Iran?
And it's anti-woman.
Anti-woman.
Get that one out of the way.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of the most common things is we're going to go free the women over there by bombing their elementary schools, right? Anybody else?
They're incredibly supportive of Palestine and the resistance.
They're incredibly supportive of Palestine and the resistance.
They propped up the Assad regime.
They propped up the Assad regime. Yeah.
I say that as a Syrian. I'm not trying to.
Yeah.
On things, but.
Yeah. They were big supporters of Bashar al-Assad, And I think we can talk about that a little bit more, but there's a history that goes back to his father, who was one of the only people who supported Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. They're allied with the Houthis, also known as Ansarullah in Yemen, and also Hezbollah in Lebanon. Yeah, the group currently engaging with the Zionists in South Lebanon. Anybody else?
Just
Sorry.
a lot about internet shutdowns and controlling journalism and speech.
Yep. Internet shutdowns, state-run media, all sorts of things like that. Welcome. So let me ask you guys another question. As people who consider themselves revolutionaries, organizers, community organizers, people who want to see a revolutionary change against Zionism, imperialism, and capitalism, what are our intellectual and organizational responsibilities? When it comes to issues like this?
To consider the messaging that we receive critically, and to hold these large groups of people that might be flattened as complex and multifaceted as possible.
Well put. Anyone else?
To resist manufacturing consent for increasing attacks in West Asia in general.
Yep. Resist imperialism, resist war in West Asia, resist the entities who've been committing genocide against Muslims for how many decades? Not just since October 7th. Cool. I think most of all, what I want to impress on everyone is it's important to have a deep strategic understanding. There are things we have to learn. There are things that our position here in the belly of the beast puts us in a certain position to act on. And if we operate off of a very limited understanding, if we take what CNN or NBC or any of these imperialist outlets tell us about another country as law and fact, we're going to end up acting in a way that they want us to act, right? You have to free your mind before you actually can free your actions too. Cool. So I have two, let's see, are we, time check. 5 minutes? Okay. Cool. So I have two kind of like quotes here. One is from a joint statement of CPUSA, the Tudeh Party, and the Communist Party of Israel. And the other is from like Jewish Voice for Peace. I'll read the Jewish Voice for Peace one. The diverse peoples of Iran have risen up in courage against their government's brutal oppression for decades, including massive protests over the past 2 months against crushing economic hardship and for a future of freedom and democracy. For this, they have faced horrific repression with reports of up to 20,000 killed and hundreds of thousands injured or arrested. But let's be clear, the history of imperialist regime change, war-making violence, and crippling sanctions on Iran and the rest of the region has for decades reinforced the oppression of the Iranian regime. Similarly, on like the other side, we have statements about liberation and salvation from reactionary and authoritarian regimes, the yoke of tyranny and the current dictatorship in Iran. So let me ask you all, these are both supposed to be anti-war, anti-imperialist statements. That's like how they're styled by the people who put them out. So like, what do y'all think of these statements?
They see the premise of the U.S. invasion, which is that Iran has a tyrannical authoritarian regime.
Right, exactly. It's part of this economy of justifying imperialism, right? They do the same thing to Cuba, and I think we tend to like see through the Cuba stuff more clearly because Cuba is like a relatively small country. Like, I don't want to say completely defenseless, but in many ways like has much less defenses against imperialism than a large country like Iran. They're more of like a perfect victim from like the Western left. But we see it too, right? Like we see that same rhetoric about the authoritarian Cuban regime, about the oppression of their people, about the lack of free speech and all these things. So what does it say about us as like a Western left if our organizations, and to me, like, to your credit, like I'm not showing all the organizations that had great statements on Iran or that had like very good ones that were principled. I'm showing you like two ones that like are flawed, right? But we have to really like think critically, like what does that say about like us as a movement? If people are being bombed, children are being killed by the hundreds, right? You have these horrific atrocities being carried out by like the Epstein regimes, essentially, right? Like the worst like people on earth. And the first thing we do before we say that it's wrong is, well, they are authoritarian. The subtext there is what? Hey, maybe they had it coming, right? Like to your point. So I think it's really important for us to understand like what does principled anti-imperialism look like, right? If you refuse to take part in this, it doesn't mean that you like think that Iran is a utopia or like these countries that the US is targeting are utopias. But to me, it like really tells us that you understand like your positionality of where you are in the United States. If you raise your voice against the Iranian government or against the Chinese government or against like, any of these other governments that may have flaws like from here in the United States, what you're really doing is like giving currency to that like imperialist aggression, right? And I think that's like the really important point to like keep in mind here. Okay, how are we doing? Okay. I think actually this is probably a good like natural stopping point. So we'll break fast in 2 minutes. You guys can start serving the food. I think there's more than enough for everybody. And then we'll reconvene in a few minutes. This is, if everyone knows, it's like Ramadan right now, so we're going to break fast and then get back to it. Cool, so I think we have a few new faces here, but we're going to just basically jump off where we left off. At any time, if you guys have questions, raise your hand. Like, we're here to discuss and kind of go through it. So we want to understand, like, where does the Islamic Republic come from? Where does the modern, like, Iranian identity come from? And I think there's two kinds of, like, important places to start. One is, like, the story of Karbala. Does anybody know what Karbala is? Yeah, tell us about Karbala.
Oh, I'm not ready for that.
Oh, okay. So Karbala was like a famous event. So I'll try to keep it short. I could probably spend 3 hours talking about Karbala, and I'm not going to do that because we have a lot of other things to talk about. But I think it's just important to understand like how key this event is to the psyche of like the Iranian people and to Shia Muslims and maybe many non-Shia Muslims as well, like who value and treasure like the descendants of the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt. So essentially, after the passing of the Prophet, peace be upon him, there was a split in like the Muslim community as to who would be like the leader of the Muslims, right? On one side, you had some of the Prophet's companions, Abu Bakr and others, and on the other side, especially after like the passing of the fourth Caliph Ali, Imam Ali, who was the Prophet's son-in-law, who married the Prophet's daughter and bore his like grandchildren. You had a bit of a split. So you had the followers of like Imam Hussein, which was Imam Ali's son, and like the followers of like the family of the Prophet. What's up, how you doing? And on the other side, you had like the dominant political power of like the caliphate, which at this point had like passed into the hands of a man named Muawiyah is like how we say it in Farsi. And essentially like, the followers of Imam Hussein, and his brother Imam Hassan, who was like actually my patrilineal ancestor, they were chased out of Yemen, traveled throughout like West Asia, where they were eventually cornered on like the plains of Karbala. And Karbala is like in modern day Iraq. And essentially like, them being the descendants of the Prophet, they posed like a big political challenge to like the ruling caliph at the time, who was Muawiyah. And so on the plains of Karbala, Imam Hussein, his followers and their family, all several hundred of them, Muawiyah and his generals demanded that Imam Hussein recognize his pledge his fealty to the caliph and recognize him as the leader of the ummah. And from Imam Hussein's perspective, Muawiyah was a oppressor, did not live up to Islamic values. There was lots of reasons that Imam Hussein essentially did not want to submit and allow Muawiyah to essentially lead the ummah. And so, their famous quote is humiliation is beyond me, is the famous quote from Imam Hussein. And what that means is essentially he chose not to kneel, and in turn, him and his entire family were slaughtered on this plains of Karbala. This is something that Shia Muslims, we still mourn to this day, the spilling of the blood of the Prophet's family, including his son Ali Asghar was murdered. And some people did make it out, obviously, the bloodline did continue. But the idea that you would rather die than accept oppression, that you would rather become a martyr, it is better to become a martyr and to die fighting oppression than to live a life of humiliation, is so central to understanding the viewpoint of the Iranian people and the Iranian state. We wonder, I don't know if you guys have seen these videos recently, we're gonna actually look at a few of them where people are marching in the streets and an Israeli or Zionist drone strike comes and strikes the middle of the crowd, and they're still marching and chanting. That kind of mental strength, that kind of dedication to fighting oppression is really religiously seated. And it's easy lots of times as Marxists, socialists to to have this very atheistic or very agnostic kind of sense when it comes to politics. But I don't think you can really understand what's going on in West Asia right now or what's going on with the Islamic Republic of Iran without understanding that religious root that's at the root of it. I don't know if anybody else wants to mention anything about Karbala or has any questions about that. It's a huge topic. I would definitely look it up. There's a lot of material out there that you can learn about the events at Karbala. People do pilgrimages every year, but just very important to understand. And so Iran was like not a Shia nation really, like until the Safavid dynasty, which was the 16th century, is like when the Safavids like started. Before that, like Iran was like, at the time also like the idea of like Sunni and Shia was not really like the same as it is now. Like that's a lot of that has been constructed by colonialism and imperialism. But at the time, like you had two big powers in West Asia. Does anybody know like what that purple nation right there is? The Ottomans. It's the Ottoman Empire, right? And in the green, you have like the Safavid Persian Empire. And like Persians had been around, like Iranians, Persians have been around in some way, shape, or form for several thousand years, right? Like, there's sort of a continuous like culture there. And like essentially like a different group, a tribe would like take over the whole country, unite everyone. Then Alexander would invade, and then they would like disperse, they'd form it together. The Mongols would invade, they would put like their own dynasty in place, and then we would disperse. The Safavids were like really the ones who unified Iran in the modern sense. The roots of like the modern Iranian state start with the Safavid era. For all intents and purposes, when we talk about modern Iranians, like this is the time frame that we're talking about. And so the Safavid dynasty, in order to, for political reasons mostly I would say, like in order to set themselves up as like a counterweight to the Ottoman Empire, adopted Shia Islam as a state religion, and like the entire population like over time converted to Shia Islam, or the majority I should say. There's still Sunnis in Iran obviously. And when we think about like the modern day axis of resistance, which we're going to talk about, I think folks like mentioned at the beginning of like the speech, like Hezbollah and Ansarullah, Yemen and Lebanon. We mentioned like the Shias, like many of them immigrated from Yemen into like West Asia and settled in Lebanon in this area called Jabal Amel, which is like in South Lebanon. And when the Safavids converted the nation to Shia Islam, many of those clerics actually from South Lebanon were brought to Iran, brought to like Safavid Persia, and made like the court clerics of like the Safavid dynasty and like their capital of Esfahan. So this is really when like Iran starts to adopt like the Shia idea, this like Karbala, like as a as sort of like a deeply rooted like quasi-national, quasi-religious, like kind of both. You know what I'm saying? Like nationalism and religious like sentiment are become like very mixed even at this point in Iran's history. So a lot of stuff happens that, like after this, and I invite you guys, like I wrote an article for People's Programs, Free the People Press. It's also up on our Medium where I talk about like the events leading to the Iranian Revolution. I think the important thing, like very brief, we don't really have time to get into like the next 400 years of Persian history, very long and complicated. Iran, as like it was one of the gunpowder empires, like Safavid era Iran was, like pretty powerful. As like Western, like capitalism, the Industrial Revolution takes off, Iran transfers from the Safavid dynasty to the Qajar dynasty. And all this land that you saw that was part of Iran starts getting carved off by the Russians, starts getting carved off by the British in like the 1900s. Through a series of like weak like Qajar era rulers, especially the Russians. Like there's like a big anti kind of Russian sentiment in Iran that's like important to mention. And a lot of that like plays out when it comes to like the history of the Soviet Union and Iran as well, which we're going to talk about. Like we are a socialist organization, but we're not going to gloss over like the contradictions there between Iran and the USSR. And eventually the Pahlavi dynasty. Have you guys heard of the Pahlavis? Like, who were the Pahlavis?
It's a group of generals, I believe, originally who usurped the Qajar dynasty, and then they're still pushing to take over. They're actually, I think, more accurately, they're groveling to become the next ruling dynasty.
Exactly. So the Qajars come to an end like towards the beginning of the 20th century, and what happens during that time? This is like the era of imperialism that Lenin talks about, right? When the whole world is getting divided up. And then critically, this is when oil is first discovered in Iran. And so the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, nowadays known as BP, British Petroleum, ends up taking control of Iran's oil through like coercion of like the Qajar dynasty. This humiliation, like the loss of Iran's territory, this like century of humiliation, really like to borrow a term from the Chinese, drives like the Iranian people to this event called the Constitutional Revolution. In 1905, they attempt to pass constitutional reforms to turn into a constitutional monarchy where you have a parliament, you have like not absolute power in these monarchs. And, the British obviously don't like this. They do a coup, they reinstate the Qajars. The Qajars continue to lose popularity. And then critically, they install the first member of the Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Pahlavi, who we know as the Shah of Iran's father. And then, after a while, they don't like what the Shah of Iran is doing. There's a lot of like popular sentiment against like the father of the Shah, Reza Pahlavi. And so through another coup, the British install Reza Pahlavi, who we know as the Shah of Iran. And, during this time period, like so much is happening and like continuing like public sentiment that's like going against these groups. And you have like also at the same time, like communism is this huge force in the world. You have these like communist groups in Iran. You have religious groups and like clerics who are like against like even like you have to imagine too like a lot of the legitimacy of the Shah's like dynasty came from religious clerics as well. So you had like actually like pro-imperialist clerics in the Shah's like court, and then you had like a growing group of like anti-imperialist like clerics and religious people. And famously there was like a massacre at the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad, which is like the holiest site in Iran, where foreign troops were brought in from Azerbaijan to massacre like protesters at the Imam Reza shrine, which is like a huge desecration of like what is the holiest site in Iran. And so, this popular sentiment continues to boil over, and in 1953, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh is elected prime minister. Have you guys heard that name before, 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh? Does anyone want to give us like the quick version of who that is? Yeah, go ahead.
He was elected prime minister, and his goal was to nationalize the oil industry, and then he was couped by the Americans.
Exactly right. And here's a fun trivia question I don't know if you guys know the answer to. Does anyone know what happened to the two prime ministers before Mohammad Mossadegh? These were pro-imperialist prime ministers. They were assassinated by a man named Nabab Safavi and his group called the Fedayeen. They were like an Islamic guerrilla group. So they assassinated two prime ministers before Mossadegh. And then when Mossadegh took office, there was like this mass sentiment to nationalize the oil industry, which probably doesn't happen without these political assassinations. It's like a super underreported part of that whole history. Nabab Safavi, I would definitely look into like who that is. So what does the US do and the British do? Like in 1953, Iran nationalizes like the third largest oil reserves in the world. BP is about to lose a bunch of money. What happens next? And you think you mentioned it, the coup, right? So yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say a coup and then isn't the Shah reinstalled?
Sorry?
Never mind. I think I'm wrong. Never mind.
Yeah, they brought the Shah back.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like Reza Pahlavi took power again and like ruled Iran until 1979. And again, like you had this mass popular sentiment. You had these people who started to talk a little bit more like critically about like colonialism and these ideas. And I think like if we really think about like what the Iranian Revolution or the Islamic Revolution was about, there's this like key term that I think you guys have to like think about and understand, and that's gharb zadegi. Has anyone heard that term before? Gharb zadegi? You're nodding. Do you know what it is?
Like West toxification or something like that?
Exactly, West toxification. It's a Farsi word that basically means like afflicted by the West. Your way of thinking, your culture. The hijab was banned in Iran for decades. You could actually go to prison for wearing a hijab for a predominantly Muslim country. Culture was changed in the metropole. You know, you guys have seen those pictures of like Iran before like the revolution, and it's a bunch of girls in like mini skirts and stuff. Like, that's that era, right? It's like the westernification of Iranian culture and Iranian society. And you have to understand, like, those images you guys see are very specific to like northern Tehran, like bourgeois, like kind of like strongholds of like compradors who were like helping facilitate like the oppression of like their fellow countrymen. Where my mom is from, like my dad is from Tehran, like that was like, you know, his life growing up, and that's why a lot of his family is like in the US now, you know. Where my mom is from in the countryside, there was no electricity, there was no plumbing, literacy rates were under 40%, I believe, especially for women, like even lower than that. It was a pretty brutal oppression for like Iranians, and like this all kind of culminated. There was like this like celebration of 2,500 years of monarchy at Persepolis, which was known as the most expensive party in history, and all these royals flew in from like all over the world, the British monarchy, and Iranians themselves were not allowed to attend this party. And they spent billions. Like it is the most lavish party. Like you guys can go look it up. It is actually like pretty wild. Like, yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned sort of this divide between like the rural and urban areas, and one thing that I've heard recently is that like one of the major like the base of the Islamic Republic exists in like the countryside of Iran, right? And like in the masses of people.
Yeah. That's absolutely correct. And like the term we use in Iran, because we have class analysis, right? Like most of us who like have studied socialism or Marxism, like we have this class analysis, and we know ways of thinking are drawn from classes, and classes are like exist in a relationship to capitalism and imperialism. In Iran, like the term we use is like the Mostazzafan and the Mostazzafin. The Mostazzafin are like the oppressed people of Iran. And exactly to your point, it's the rural people who are like predominantly more religious to this day. And it's like the poor industrial workers, like the lumpen proletariat is like one term that we use like in English, like, although is that like German? I don't know. Lumpen proletariat is like one like term we use, but that's like where the real base of support lies. Because right, if you're like you go to college, you get a job with like an oil firm, you're like driving like a foreign car, and your countrymen are poor, like you're probably not the kind of person that wants to see a revolution. You got it good, right? You're like those Cubans in Miami, pretty much, right? And people, like, we don't talk about that enough, that like most of the Iranians you guys meet in the US are like the descendant of like some version of like Miami Cubans. Like that's absolutely a fact, and like I think more people are kind of seeing it now. So you have this like mass uprising of like what we ends up turning into like the Islamic Revolution. I think like I love this Fidel Castro quote. This is from a speech he gave in 2001 at Tehran University. He says to the Iranian people, he says, "You were able to throw the biggest gendarme in the region, not with guns, but with your ideas, culture, and patriotism. One Shah still remains in the world. That is the Shah of imperialism, which is entrenched near my homeland. It is an exploiting Shah that wants to impose its system on the entire world and drag it into oppression. But as the Shah of Iran is overthrown, this Shah too will fall." This is like just a little ABC clip.
The President and the Shah met for about an hour this morning. The President said the Shah's visit was encouraging and had strengthened the strong ties of friendship between the two countries.
Despite the temporary imposition of martial law, the Shah's new government appears determined to press ahead with liberal reform. It is from the mosques that opposition to the Shah is being led by puritanical Shiite Muslims. The religious zealots want to return to the Constitution of 1906, which would ensure all legislation conforms with Islamic law.
Almost 40,000 refinery workers went on strike today, virtually cutting off Iran's petroleum exports.
University students demonstrating in Tehran shouting death to the Shah pledge allegiance to the Islamic movement of the Ayatollahs.
The number killed in Tehran since the beginning of the month is probably well over 100. But people in this crowd were saying and believing 7,000 had been killed. Emotions over the dead and the rumors of dead are high. Every day here now, the demonstrations and arrests go on. Rumors in Tehran say people are being armed and may soon start firing back at the troops.
News there would be some kind of announcement about a new government came after yet another day of running confrontations in the center of Tehran. The army kept moving today, trying to head off the demonstrations, keep them where possible from growing in size. This dogged military resistance to the anti-Shah services, part of an effort to buy the Shah as much time as possible in which to create a political solution. Demonstrations like these today in Tehran are a daily occurrence in towns throughout the country now, and one sign of the fact there is nothing less than a kind of revolution being attempted here, trying to change the form of Iran's government, and unlikely to settle easily for any solution which still keeps the Shah on his throne. Daily, it has become more difficult to look at the scope of opposition to the Shah of Iran and still see his monarchy surviving. The Ayatollahs are committed to the ouster of the Shah and nothing less than that. They chant, Makbar Shah, death to the Shah.
The new Prime Minister has gone some liberal political business beyond the Shah, but not likely far enough to suit the anti-Shah religious establishment or members of the political opposition.
The Shah and his empress left shortly before midday. The empire he had hoped to build had been shattered by a year of violence.
The news spread with the speed of the human shout. Shah Farari Shodeh, the people cried, the Shah has escaped. The old chant of death to the Shah was replaced today by a new one, death to Carter. There is still a strong sentiment against American interests in Iran and the widespread belief that the United States has taken the profits from Iranian oil. Khomeini, Khomeini, they cried, we're waiting for you. The Ayatollah is expected to return to Iran, but when or how is not yet known.
That's from Western News, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Could you explain a little bit about the function of the Shah in Iran and like what factions they represented?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important, like, to understand the function of the Shah in Iran. Like, we have some examples of like modern day Shahs in the Gulf right now, right? We have these Gulf monarchies who are facilitating Zionism, normalizing with the Zionist-like regime. And it comes back to like that Sykes-Picot era of like the early 20th century where all these like countries were carved up, monarchies were installed, and the Shah, like, really, I think, like, his family represents like part of that like imperialist like insertion of like a political leader. Nowadays we call it neocolonialism, right? Like, it's not a direct colonial occupation, but it's a representative who kind of like runs the country for you as like a colonial power. I think to your point, like in terms of like the class character, is that kind of what you're getting at of like the Shah himself and like who he represented? Is that right? Like that was your question, or?
Partly, yes.
Okay.
Like both who wanted the Shah there and also who the Shah himself was representing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Shah, like people who wanted him there, the British, the Americans, colonial powers. Iran, you have to understand, like at one point in time, Iran was the biggest ally of the U.S. in the Middle East. Like even before like Israel and the United States formed like their special relationship like it is today. Like the Shah and like the Islamic Republic of the Kingdom of Iran, like the Persian Kingdom of Iran, was like a bulwark of like Western imperialism in the country or in that region. As opposed to like at that time there was a lot of like Arab nationalism movements going on, like whether in Syria or Egypt. Like that was sort of a counterpoint, right, to that. In terms of like the domestic class character, you know, the compradors, like, are you guys familiar with that term comprador? Does anyone know what that means or want to explain it? Yeah, go ahead.
Aren't compradors like collaborators with the imperialists? Is that not?
Exactly. Yeah, the collaborators, right? The people, in Farsi we say vatan furush, like one who sells his homeland. Like that's like the phrase we use to describe like that class essentially. And they're, you know, kind of like we were saying, like based in the metropole, you know, bourgeoisified in a lot of ways, West Toxified, like Abzadigi, like that's all kind of like part of like that class character of that group of people. Did I answer your question? Sorry, I don't know if I fully answered it.
And then like what level of I guess power did the Shah have, and like what would be an equivalent political designation?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about authoritarian dictators, like when one person leaves the country and the entire system of government collapses, like the Shah, right? There's probably some other more contemporary examples. Like that's an authoritarian dictatorship, right? I don't know if like what the best like comparison would be, but like I think the Gulf monarchies honestly are a pretty good one. Like Mohammed bin Salman and like Saudi is like maybe a good like comparison point. And yeah, like I think like he had control over like a large state apparatus, and there was a group called SAVAK, right? Have you ever heard of SAVAK? SAVAK? Yeah, do you know what it is?
I remember it's like the secret police kind of.
Essentially. SAVAK was set up by the CIA and Mossad, and they would kidnap people, torture people to death. Like they were responsible for basically like crushing any kind of left or like Islamist like revolutionary movements in the country. If you know, for example, like my uncle was actually executed, like arrested by SAVAK and like executed on his 18th birthday in Iran. My dad's younger brother, because he was involved with like a communist organization. So just like to understand, like if Mossad is training these guys, like, you know, you can follow that to like its logical conclusion about what kind of group this was, right? And that's like what it was. The Shah, like there was so much anti-Shah sentiment and so much anti-Western sentiment in Iran that like that level of repression was necessary to maintain power for as long as he did. Cool. So I think we talked quite a bit about why the revolution happened. I want to ask like a question to you guys. Like oftentimes we hear like this story from like diaspora who are like not quite like chest-beating Zionists who are like, oh, the revolution was stolen, you know? Like it was a revolution of all different types of people, liberals, communists, Islamists, like all different people. Like why did it end up taking this Islamic character? Like why were there huge pictures of Khomeini being like paraded through the streets and not of like Marx and Lenin and Mao and like these folks? Does anyone like want to guess or like ask about that? Or you know, what do you guys think about that? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a guess. I don't know actually, but I kind of knew that the like clerics were very important before, like even during the Shah's time, like they weren't completely like taken out basically. So they still had a large power base there. So I'm assuming that definitely had an effect on it, but I'm not sure.
I think that's 100% right. Well, that's not 100% of the explanation, but it's a good portion of it, right? Like, they were integrated with the masses in such a way dating back to the Safavid dynasty. Like, you couldn't root out religion from the Iranian like society as hard as you might try. Yeah, go ahead.
So, were clerics, how were clerics interacting with the people, especially in the rural areas? How were they engaging with them?
For sure. I think one thing to keep in mind about Iranian society, like prior to like modern industrialization, and it's still true to an extent today, it's like a highly tribal society, right? You have like lots of rural groups that are like built around these clans and tribes and like these smaller villages. And so every village had like a cleric, and that cleric would travel to Qom, or they would travel to Najaf in Iraq, or like Karbala, and they would like go study in like the seminary, and they would come back and like teach those lessons, right? And that's where like those stories of Imam Hussein and these sacrifices and fighting oppression would be like brought back into like the lifeblood of the community, and that dates all the way back to the Safavid era, right, with like those Lebanese like clerics. So they live in the village, they're like based there, like they leave the village to go study and they come back, and they're bringing that politics in. And every Friday when they're doing their like Friday prayers, like in Islam, like Friday's like, you know, holy day, and typically like, you know, even here, all of us like who are Muslim, like we go to the mosque, and like on Fridays there's like a khutbah, which is like a lecture that like the local imam or sheikh like gives, and oftentimes it takes like political, social, cultural like elements, right? Like, so that's like one of the main sites that people would be like getting like radicalized essentially.
What's the difference between a clerk and an imam?
So imam is like more like a higher title in Shia Islam. So it's like a cleric is like anybody who like goes and studies at the seminary, but an imam is like recognized at like a certain level of like they've passed certain exams, they've studied for a certain amount of time, they've authored their own like theological analysis of like the Quran. Like there's like a certain like threshold basically to become like an imam, or an ayatollah is like another like title.
Yeah. Also, I have a question about the ayatollah title. Like, when does one become like a grand ayatollah? That's a separate question. I also want to answer as to why the revolution took more of an imam as opposed to a communist form factor is because I believe that Iran was steeped in Cold War anti-communism, right? And they served sort of as a bulwark against the Soviets in the region. And so I would guess that there was a lot of anti-communism within Shah's Iran that took place prior that gave the clerics a better position than the communists.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like you had a lot of anti-communist stuff happening. You couldn't quite go after the clerics the same way you could the communists without like instigating a lot more like ill feelings with the people. I think there's also like some key missteps that the Soviet Union made. So, you know, you guys know that like the Soviet Union at one point supported the foundation of the State of Israel. And that like rubbed a lot of Muslims and Iranians the wrong way, like from the get-go. The other thing is like during World War I, like after World War I, when like the Soviets took over power in Russia, they broke away a part of Iran, Gilan province, and like formed a separatist state there. And if there's one thing like to know about Iranians, like one through line you'll see like as we keep going is like Iranians are fiercely nationalistic. You know, that Persian identity is like super deep rooted. So like a foreign power coming in and carving out a part of your country is something that like is a generational grudge, let me put it that way, you know. And then during like Stalin's time also, he carved out like Azerbaijan, which is formerly part of like the Persian Empire, and like made that into a Soviet socialist republic, which from their perspective, hey, we're spreading socialism, more people are under the socialist system. But if you're an Iranian, you look at that and you say, okay, well, the names have changed, it's the Communist Party and not the Tsar, but they're still doing the same thing to us. Like that's kind of like the mindset that people had. I think like the last point too, when I talk about that Persian nationalism is like, Persian nationalism mixed with like that Shia like pride and everything is like, a lot of Iranians like, because you had that deep-rooted religion, and maybe in a country like Vietnam or China, you don't have that. Like what Khomeini like theorized and talked about that really resonated with people is like he had this like famous phrase like neither east nor west, like we will form like a pole like in the Middle East, like we will form an Islamic power in the Middle East, and we can stand on our own 2 feet without relying on like the East or West. So I think those are all kind of like contributing factors there. In addition, like I think just the Tudeh party itself, the Communist Party in Iran, like made a lot of missteps. Like they were tailing the masses. Like they opposed the nationalization of oil at one point. Like there was like some like major kind of like missteps that the Tudeh party did. And I think like great thing to study, you know, as a socialist or communist here in the U.S. is like tailism, and like when you follow the masses too far behind, like you lose like your faith in them. So that was like another big thing. Is like there's just like several kind of like missteps that happened throughout the 20th century with the Tudeh party that like between the repression and those other factors we talked about that like ultimately left them to be like marginalized.
You use this term of like following the masses too far behind. Could you expand a little bit more on like what that means?
Yeah, for sure. I think like I'll give like a good example, which is like if we look at the 2020 uprisings against police brutality. If we look at like the masses of like young brown and black people in like the United States, the majority like were opposed to the police and like believed in abolition of some form, right, or community-led policing of some form. And what we saw is like a lot of these groups, like nonprofit groups and so on, like liberal groups, kind of came in and were like, oh, like defund the police, reform the police, body cams, right? And that's an easy, exactly, right? And that's an easy way to lose the support of the people who are being oppressed by the system right now, right? Like when George Jackson talks about like I am the slave, like the revolution has to happen now, like when you lose those people, like the revolutionary movement loses its engine, essentially. Does that make sense? Good contemporary example, great question. Yeah.
I want to contribute something just to like why the revolution in Iran took on that like Islamic face. And I think it's like to understand in the Muslim tradition, the credibility that Muslims have, like the masses of Muslims afford to like Islamic scholarship or Islamic credibility is like deeply part of the belief system of Muslims, like everywhere and throughout history, going back to the Prophet, the time of Prophet Muhammad. And so I think like that is an important factor in understanding like what the Muslim psyche is and how that like relates to not only their belief systems, like in terms of religious organization, but like political, like their politics as well. Yeah.
Beautifully put. I couldn't have said it better myself. It's a part of our society, like it's part of the social fabric of our society. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I think like the idea of like religion and politics mixing and like the separation of church and state, like a lot of that comes from a very Western viewpoint, right? Like that in the West, like what is the history of religion in our societies? Like what role did like the church play in the medieval era? Like leading into capitalism, the conflict between like religion and liberalism. Like it shapes so much of the way we think about religion and we don't even realize it. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but that's a great point. Like you can't take that Eurocentric understanding of religion and just copy and paste it to like Muslim societies, right? And actually that is a question here, yeah. So how does Islam in West Asia differ from Christianity in the West? Like why do we insist on secular politics here? There's a really great author I would check out, Ali Shariati, who like talks about this in like the Iranian complex. Like definitely check out Ali Shariati. But he talks about like, for example, like in the Western tradition, even before like monotheism, like before the Romans became like Christians, what was the role of like the Greek gods, right? Like the Western tradition traces its like lineage to the Greeks, so I think that's a great place to start. Like what did the Greek gods represent in their society? What was that?
Vice, in a sense, like sort of there was a lot of hubris stories
Yeah.
about, like knowing your place.
Exactly. You do something and nature or God is going to come down and strike you down. You fly too close to the sun, you're going to fall into the ground. And like, you know, all the gods, they had like sort of like nature-esque like things, right? There was like the god of thunder, the god of the ocean, you know, all these things that kind of like would punish the hubris of humans, right? Like God was this thing to be feared, you know, this is thing to like control like your behavior as like a human being. That's not how Islam is in like Muslim societies, right? It's like in the Muslim like imagination of like monotheism and like Allah is like that he's like a guiding, like he sends prophets as a guiding light for humanity to follow in his steps, to like, you know, live in a way that like he wants us to, right? It's like it's always like this all forgiving, all like welcoming God, which is like, you know, even the Catholic God of like Catholic guilt and all these things like tends to be a little bit different, right? It adopts some of that Greek like that Greek way of thinking about like religion. And so in the West, like you actually like transition from like feudalism and like the Middle Ages and this type of like Christianity to like liberal capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. The bourgeoisie, the merchants in Europe who ended up taking power from like the feudal lords and nobles in Europe, they had to combat religion and politics so that they could take power, right? Like that was like part of their process of taking control. And every like way of thinking we have today, humanism and liberalism and Kant and like all these ideas of like, you know, like these like European like Renaissance thinkers and etc. Like it all stems from that. It all stems from a class struggle between the European like bourgeoisie and the European like feudal class. And so we have to understand that, right? Like when we like talk about, oh, like we just want a secular society in Iran and like a nice secular revolution, like that is a Eurocentric point of view, right? Like you're talking about a society where their relationship to religion and like to the sister's point, like is totally different than like what we might think of as like Westerners, right? Cool. And then last thing I'll kind of add here is like this is actually the first time then that Quds Day becomes a thing. Does everyone know what Quds Day is? Like today is a Quds Day. Like yeah, go ahead.
Going back to that, is Iran primarily like what percentage of the population is like Shia Muslim or?
Yeah, I mean, there's like different estimates out there, and obviously they have their own like biases and stuff. Like my estimation, based off like different things I read, is like around 60 to 70% are Shia, around 20% is Sunni, and then there's like religious minorities from there. So we have like a large Armenian Christian population that like dating back to the time of like Isa, like the Christ the prophet, like there were like have been Christians in Iran, and then there's still some like 5%-ish of like Zoroastrians. Like when I went to Yazd, that's like an old Zoroastrian city. Like there's still active like Zoroastrian like fire temples and stuff there. And one thing to note, like this wasn't part of the question, but like religious minorities in Iran, and there's also Jewish people in Iran, right? Iran is like one of the largest Jewish populations in the Middle East or West Asia. There are guaranteed seats for Jews, for Christians, for Zoroastrians in the Iranian parliament that actually outweighs their like populational representation. Like there's more representation in Iran's parliament for those groups than they make up like actually like the portion of the population. And they have their own elections that like elect these like specific people. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. And I thank you for the other point.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is like people think of like West Asia as like this very like mono like cultural like entity, but like, you know, you mentioned you were Syrian, like there's tons of Christians in Syria, there's Sunnis, Shias, like Alawites, like all these different like types of like ethnic and religious groups, right? Like
I'm Syrian Christian, and that's the big thing, is most Syrian Christians supported the Assad regime for the secular government aspect. So
yeah.
I was just curious.
Yeah, Lebanon's another example, right? You have like the Christian like Maronites in like Lebanon, like it's always more complicated than you think. Like that's like one of the short version of it. Like okay, so we talked about Quds Day. I asked that question earlier, but do you guys know what Quds Day is? Like today is like a Quds Day forum. Does anyone want to like? No, you don't know? Go for it. Yep. It's the last Friday of Ramadan. It is like a day for the liberation of Palestine, where all Muslims like should demonstrate, educate, like do what I'm doing right now, right? Like there's that Quds Day protest today at Embarcadero, like the PYM put on. I'm sure some of you were there. That's like what Quds Day is. Do you know like when Quds Day started? Does anyone know who like declared Quds Day and how it started? Khomeini. In 1979, when the revolution succeeded, he declared Quds Day the last Friday of Ramadan, and now it's observed by essentially like all Muslims worldwide. And that comes from the Islamic like revolution. There was other things that happened in 1979 as well. Iran at the time was supplying, before the revolution, was supplying 90% of South Africa's oil. They cut that funding completely and started funding the ANC, which was Nelson Mandela's party. So you see like all these like really big revolutionary changes happening like right when the revolution happens. So I think that's like a nice segue. Like it's Quds Day, we should talk about Palestine. Like we can't talk about Iran without talking about Palestine. Does anyone know who this is? Nizar Banat? I probably didn't say his name right. Yeah, Geraldo, go ahead.
Yeah, he's a Palestinian journalist that was very much anti-normalization of the Zionist entity as well as anti-normalization with the Palestinian Authority. And he was actually assassinated by the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah, exactly.
الناس اللي مش عاجبها ايران، من وينك الصواريخ يا حبيبي؟ طب ما انت بتصفق للصواريخ وبتصفر لها وبتكون مبسوط وانت مع المقاومه، من وينك الصواريخ هاي؟ اللي حمد غزه، انا مش تستحي وتخجل منك إله. بقول لك انه ايران تستخدم القضيه الفلسطينيه من اجل نشر التشيع. ايران لو بدها تنشر التشيع، ليش تتحمل 42 سنه حصار؟ كذا 100 مليار دولار حجزت لها وبتعطيك من قوت يومها تصرف عليك وعلى المقاومه الفلسطينيه. مش بحاجه. الدوله الوحيده يعني من دول العالم كلها وضعت بند ثابت في موازنتها. في موازنه خبز المواطن الايراني وضعت بند دعم الثوره الفلسطينيه. بصرف النظر من كان. فتح، جبهة شعبية، شيوعي، يساري، ضراب طبل، ما تدخلت نهائيا بتركيبتنا الايديولوجية لفكرة المقاومة. خذ صير زلمة محارب. مشكلة إيران مع أمريكا مش من جديد، مش من بدايات الثورة السورية، مع الاحترام يا متخلف منك إله. مشكلة الإيرانيين مع أمريكا بدأت عام 1953 حين انقلبت أمريكا، قادت انقلاب على حكومة محمد مصدق وعلى رغبة الشعب الإيراني الذي طرد الشاه في 53. اجت أمريكا وبريطانيا دبروا انقلاب على المرحوم محمد مصدق ورجعوا الشاه، والموساد كان شريك في ذلك. الثأر الأمريكي الإيراني بلش من زمان، بس إيران يعني أمي عندها كرامة وعندها شرف وعارفة بالضبط أن وجود الأمريكي هو المشكلة، وجود الإسرائيلي هو المشكلة. إيران تريد أن تحمي عمقها العربي. إحنا المفروض نطلع على إيران كجزء من العمق الإسلامي. الإيراني شريكك حضاريا وتاريخيا وجغرافيا ودينيا، شئت أم أبيت. هذا شريك غصب عنك ومن حقه أن يقود مرحلة. أنت كعربي فرطت في كل أماناتك التاريخية، فرطت في أمانتك على قوميتك، فرطت في أمانتك على الإسلام، فرطت في أمانتك حتى على لغتك. صار الإيراني يجيدها أكثر منك.
Yeah, I guess before we move on, like, has anybody seen that clip before or like heard that sentiment? You know, I can pull up like 10 other videos of like the PFLP making similar statements, of like the DFLP, like all these Palestinian resistance groups. But there's like this one quote that always sticks with me, and somebody's going to tell me who said it because I can't remember who exactly, but it's like, if you're in solidarity with our corpses but not our rockets.
Oh, yeah, I remember that tweet. That was from 2021.
Yeah. Right? Like, it's easy for anyone to jump out and say, oh, I'm pro-Palestine, free Palestine, right? But if you're not supporting the people who are actually putting their lives on the line, fighting against the Zionists, like... Sorry?
Oh, free Palestine how?
Yeah. Like, it's empty words, right? It's like when like spreading blood, like the lamb's blood on the door so like God doesn't punish you, right? Like it's like that sort of like thing, right? It's like when in 2020 when like businesses would like throw the Black Lives Matter thing on their windows so you wouldn't smash their windows in during the protests, right? Like, I don't know if that's a good analogy, but like, you know, to me it's kind of like that. It's virtue signaling. It's like intended to like, oh, I'm pro-Palestine, but also I like have all the same critiques of all of like the Zionists' enemies that like they tell me in the news on CNN, right? Like, that's not solidarity, is it? Like, how can you show solidarity with the people if you don't believe in their internationally recognized right to fight back? I think that's like the important point to really like think about here. And so when we talk about like who is fighting back against Zionism, what is the force that is preventing Greater Israel from taking shape? And does anyone know does everyone know what Greater Israel is? Has everyone heard that term before? Someone want to give us like the quick one?
From the Nile to the Euphrates.
From the Nile to the Euphrates. All of the land of the Arabs will be ours. It is our rightful land. It was promised to us 6,000, 8,000, whatever it is. X thousand years ago. Yeah, right? So, you know, it's easy to kind of sit here, you know, I can say like, oh, neither Washington nor Hezbollah or Iran or the PFLP or Hamas is like the big one that everyone likes to beat up on, right? But in practice, what does that mean if I'm sitting here in the United States?
You're supporting the United States.
Exactly. So that's why, like, as organizers, as revolutionaries, like everyone in this room who does some form of community organizing and political education, like, it's important for us to be extremely steadfast in that line. Even if Hamas has views that we don't agree with, right? Like, maybe on homosexuality, maybe on, like, different issues that are, like, a little bit offensive to our Western sensibilities, or, like, you know, we might even find, like, abhorrent in some way, shape, or form. We have this concept of, like, the principal contradiction that, like, Mao Zedong talks about. Has everyone heard that term before, the principal contradiction? Someone want to explain real quick what that means? Yeah, go ahead.
The principal contradiction is an imperialism that we must address that by any means necessary before we address these further contradictions that stem from it.
Yeah, exactly. In order for people to have self-determination and to allow whatever communities in these like nations or in these places to struggle for like their own social conditions, they have to be free from imperialism first, right? Like otherwise, like we're the equivalent of people being like, like in, let's say you're like in the Spanish Empire in like the 16th century, like, you know, I don't agree with what we did to the Aztecs, but they were sacrificing people. They're kind of pagans, you know, like maybe they needed to be civilized, right? Like that's something we do all the time in the West with like other countries, right? Like So I think it's just important to understand, like, okay, if we're militants, if we're political organizers, if we're trying to like enact revolutionary change and to like really bring examples of like revolutionary struggle to the people, like we have to be really steadfast in our support for these groups, and to be ready to like do this type of political education of like the principal contradiction, understanding where these groups lie. Because if we sit here in the belly of the beast and we like don't take on this position of revolutionary defeatism, of like opposition to our own government, who is by far the most evil government in the world, who has more bodies like piled up than any other government that has ever existed in history, supports dictatorships like the Zionist regime, then we're essentially giving our consent to our own government's genocide, and we benefit from it. We do. Look how cheap gas was up until this week, right? Like, look how cheap we were able to get manufactured goods from China. Like, our entire way of life here is built off of the exploitation of the third world, and it's like that has to like be foundational to like any kind of organizing we do. So I know that was like a lot of like what is the word I'm looking for? Like, I'm like giving speeches and shouting at you guys what to think. Like, I don't really like doing that. So let's you can't tell. It might seem like I like doing it, but I don't. Sorry, I think I saw a hand go up for a sec. No?
No.
Oh, okay. Let's talk about the axis of resistance. Have you guys heard this term before, the axis of resistance? Does anyone want to give me like a short version of what is the axis of resistance?
It's a group of countries with kind of Iran leading, country groups that are resisting like imperial powers of the West Asia, basically. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Palestine, Iran, West Syria, like the Assad, and then Russia, kind of.
Yeah, essentially like state and non-state actors in West Asia that are fighting against like Zionism. Does everyone know, like, do you guys know who these people are? Shout them out.
Hassan Nasrallah.
Who was Hassan Nasrallah?
He was the Secretary General, I believe, of Hezbollah, and he was martyred in 2024, I believe.
And the important thing to know about Hassan Nasrallah is Israel occupied Lebanon like several times throughout the last like 30 or 40 years, especially in the 80s and 90s. The first Lebanese resistance and the first army to actually defeat Israel in a land war was Hezbollah, led by Hassan Nasrallah. And I think, like, again, Hezbollah is one of these organizations that we do not endorse. There's a lot of interesting things that you might be able to learn by studying the history of Hezbollah, operating under a state that's openly hostile to it, but at the same time building hospitals, credit unions, institutions, dual power, like all these things as socialists that we might say like we believe in and like want to know how to do. One of the most recent examples of this being done successfully is staring us right in the face, and Islamophobia might be the only thing keeping us from actually studying it. Does anyone know who the gentleman on the bottom right is?
Yahya Sinwar.
And who was Yahya Sinwar?
He was like a chairman of Hamas and was martyred like a little bit ago, like actively fighting the Israeli entity in Gaza.
Yep. A brave leader of the Palestinian resistance. He died with a stick in his hand that he threw at an Israeli drone. He fought to the last breath and became a hero for millions of colonized people around the world. And then I'm going up in the levels of difficulty here. Does anyone know who the bottom left is? Who was Qasem Soleimani? Yeah, he was the head of the Quds force in Iran, which was like Iran's strategic depth, right? The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, which is like, I don't want to go super into what the Revolutionary Guard is. That's like a big conversation. But essentially, like Iran's like state military that's apart from their regular military, like the defenders of the revolution. The IRGC is like 8 or 9 million people. It actually is like close to like 10% of the Iranian population is in the IRGC. If you count like the Basiji, which is like the community patrols and police and stuff. Fun fact, Qasem Soleimani is from the same village as my mom. And during the Iran-Iraq war, when my mom was a kid, like the invasion was going so bad, the Iraqi invasion of Iran, like so bad for the Iranians, that they were training like teenagers and kids to like fight, like in the ground war. So my mom, like every Thursday, she would go, something like that. It was like once a week she would go to like shooting classes. And her shooting instructor was this super handsome guy that would like come in from the front lines every once in a while, like when he was home, and teach the kids like how to shoot. And like apparently the girls all had a big crush on him. And that guy was Qasem Soleimani. You should see my mom reload a gun.
Was the IRGC state-sponsored, or would it be considered like a paramilitary group that just saw a lot of success?
it started off during the revolution, like when it started, like its nucleus was a little bit more of a paramilitary, but after the Islamic Revolution, it became like sanctioned as part of like the Iranian state structure. Yeah. The Basiji could kind of be considered as paramilitary, and like, I don't know, have you guys heard of the Basiji before? Anyone? It's like a huge like community patrol group that like the quote unquote morality police was like part of the Basiji, like all these different like community policing functions. And I think it's like an important one, like when we talk about like abolitionism and stuff. Like, does anyone remember like what was the Black Panther Party's demand for like around policing? Like, what was the exact language of that demand?
Was it community control?
Community control of policing. Basijis patrol the neighborhoods that they live in. During the recent war that's happening right now, it's the Basijis that are pulling people out of the rubble, that are like administering CPR, that are like doing that kind of like material aid in their communities. So just like, you hear a lot of fear mongering about these groups, but it's important to understand like what exactly they are, rather than like, you know, the imperialists depend on you hearing the word Hamas and like freaking out and being like, oh, they're a bunch of terrorists, or the IRGC are a bunch of terrorists, or like whatever. It's important to actually like have a scientific understanding of what these like people's role in like the state structure and like community structure actually are. So Qasem Soleimani was the one who like helped set up tunnels that were leading to Palestine and to Gaza, like helped supply like with Hamas and the PFLP. Like when the Martyr was talking about all this like support Iran was giving, like Qasem Soleimani stood at the top of that. Like he fought ISIS in Iraq. He like helped liberate Iraq from like ISIS, set up a bunch of like basically strategic depth for the axis of resistance. And what happened was in 2020, if you guys remember, like the United States like called him for negotiations. He flew to Baghdad, and on his way from the airport to the negotiation site, they drone striked him. A high official of like a foreign country, like an illegal drone strike. And I think that's like sort of a flashpoint also in like this whole like current crisis to like kind of keep in mind. This last one, I don't think anyone's gonna get this last one. Does anyone know who this is? This is an IRGC commander, Mohaddam. He was martyred like, I wanna say like 15 years ago. But I mentioned this just because, you know, Iran, like right now, you guys like, raise your hand if you like watching videos of Tel Aviv getting bombed. Come on. You know, those missiles and stuff, they were developed domestically in Iran, but the nucleus of that missile program was started by this guy. And he actually traveled to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, like derogatorily known as North Korea in like the West. And much of that missile technology was actually like transferred by the Koreans to like the Iranians, and that formed like the nucleus of like the Iranian like missile program. The Koreans and the Syrians were basically like, the only two countries during the Iran-Iraq war that supported the Iranians. That's like very important to remember here. Cool. So I want to talk a little about the Islamic Republic, and this is where we're going to get into like the really like tense stuff. Everyone's ready, right? We're going to struggle as a group. So what are some things we're told about the Islamic Republic? You guys can shout them out, or you can read them off the slide. Like, what are some things that you hear about the Islamic Republic if you like watch the news or whatever? Like, talk to like specific people, liberals and whatnot. Oppressive dictatorship.
The hijab mandate.
The hijab mandate. Regime. Yeah. So I think the first kind of myth to dispel here is like, you know, we talked about like an authoritarian dictatorship like the Shah. When the Shah left, the entire government structure crumbled. What just happened in Iran like a week ago? Yeah. Yeah, Ali Khamenei was like, you know, assassinated essentially. Iran still seems to be a functioning society. They're still able to launch missiles. They're still able to mount civil defense and rescue missions. The regime hasn't fallen like the Israelis and Americans probably assumed it would. That's because Iran is like not actually an authoritarian fascist dictatorship. There are many policies that have happened in Iran that were actually opposed to like Khamenei's own personal views, right? For example, like Khamenei was like a big believer in the hijab mandate. But in the last 5 years, like the hijab mandate has essentially disappeared. Like if you go to Iran now, like you'll see many women wearing hijab and many women not wearing hijab. That's like a fact when you go there. It's like most other Muslim countries in that way. He opposed like a lot of neoliberal economic reforms that have happened since the 90s. But because the masses of the people who maybe were influenced by Western propaganda or whatever, that's a lot of internal Iranian issues. Like he allowed a lot of these like neoliberal economic reforms to happen that like ultimately have like been not great for the country. So it's important to understand it's like Iran is like a republic. Like in the truest sense, it is a republic, and a republic is like a representative democracy essentially. The group that just picked like the new supreme leader, which is his son Mujtaba, that Guardian Council, or sorry, the Assembly of Experts, was voted directly by like the voters, right? And then the supreme leader picks like the Guardian Council, which like has like its own like sort of ability. So there's like, I don't really need to go like deep into like every single aspect of this, but it has a parliament that's elected, a president that's elected, an assembly expert that ultimately chooses the most powerful like office in like Iran. It's a republic. It doesn't look like our three branches of government, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, people shit on Iran for government, like, oh, they don't directly elect their supreme leader. We don't either. We have an electoral college as well.
Right.
It's like, it's a very similar form of government that they have. It is a constitutional republic.
Very naive question. Like, when I hear that his son is the guy who's elected, it like throws a sense of doubt. It's like, if Trump was to be assassinated, his son
Barron Trump president.
Yeah. It really throws doubt on this like national. Well, like, can you explain that process?
For sure. I think it's like, to be honest, if he hadn't been assassinated, I don't think it would have happened. Like, it was a bit of a surprise that he got elected for me and for other people. So like, I think the person that most of us thought would get, there was two people that were kind of considered the front runners before he was assassinated. One was Arafi, who was like the head of like the Friday Seminary in Qom. And the other one was Ejai, who was like the head of the judiciary. That's who we all thought was going to be. It's like one of those guys. And then there was like some outsider ones like Rouhani, who's like a reformist, like, you know, kind of like more pro-Western, like, and whatnot. I think if Khamenei had not been assassinated, if the US had not started war with Iran, and he had just died of cancer in like 2 years, like he was sick, and like that might likely would have happened, we probably wouldn't have seen this. But I think it comes down to like the Iranian psyche and like the Iranian state and its like view towards the West. You killed the supreme leader, you killed his family. You go on TV saying, I'm going to choose the next supreme leader. That's what Trump said. He went on TV and said, I'm going to choose the next supreme leader of Iran, just like we did in Venezuela, which I'm not going to get into that one. There's that defiance, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, you don't want us to pick this guy. And to understand like Moshtaba also, like where he sits in like the Iranian political spectrum, Moshtaba like fought in the front lines of the Iran-Iraq War as a 16, 17-year-old. He went out onto the front lines, like his comrades were killed, he was injured, you know. He is very close to a lot of IRGC leadership. And so like, even like if you look at the political spectrum of Iran, like Moshtaba out of everybody was considered like the closest to military out of everybody, like the hardline military leader out of all of like the front runners essentially. And you know, all the front runners have to meet like certain criteria, like they have to be like, for example, like imams, like they have to have like a certain level of religious expertise and whatnot. Because Iran is in the state of crisis of war against like the imperialist countries, to me like that's why they ended up going with the guy who's closest to the IRGC. Like the generals and the military guys are in charge right now. Like that's really what the election of Moshtaba should like tell you. I don't know if that like answers your question, but like that's kind of like, if you look at the political aspects of what led to him like getting elected, like that's sort of my analysis of it.
So it's just coincidence that it's his son?
I mean, a lot of support.
Exactly, but yeah.
Yeah. And it's also like, you need like strength, like you're worried about like destabilization, like the dad just became a martyr, which like, if he went from having probably somewhat of a complicated like legacy if he had passed away naturally, but like this way he passed away where like they tried to evacuate him and he said, no, 90 million people can't evacuate. Like, I think Adeh Khamenei was like pretty genius in the way he sacrificed himself. Like the way that he died ended up uniting like the whole country, ended up uniting Muslims in like other countries. Like he became a martyr essentially, who was like beloved by millions of people. It was one of the biggest blunders like the United States could have made, honestly. I think because of that, it raised Mojtaba's profile even higher. Like that was part of it too. Yeah, go ahead.
Also the symbolism of like Mojtaba's entire family, like his wife and children also being martyred in the same strike that killed his father. I've heard like some analyses that say that like it was by them choosing him, it's like a big like fuck you to like the US for being like, well, you try to get rid of him, maybe someone who's like even has like harder lines than his father is in his place, and like even less like aligned or leaning towards negotiations or like any type of neutral position towards the West. So those are also factors maybe to consider in like why he got elected. Yeah.
Totally right. Ali Khamenei was like considered a moderate. Like, despite how he's painted in the West, like he was a moderate in Iran. Mojtaba is like way more of like a, you know, believes in building the nuclear bomb, doesn't believe in negotiating with like the Western regimes. You know, like yeah. Sorry, you had your hand up.
I have two questions. First is like, I guess I have three questions. 1 and 2 are, is Supreme Leader elected for life? And then what is the relationship between the Supreme Leader and the President? And then we'll ask my third question.
Yeah. The answer is yes. Like it is a lifetime appointment. Like we've only had 3 in our history now. Mojtaba is like the 3rd one. The important thing to understand is like Supreme Leader is like the Western title we put on this position. The actual title that person has is Rahbar Enqilab. Rabat is like the leader or the master, and Enqilab is like the revolution. They're the leader of the Islamic revolution. They're not the head of the Iranian state, actually. Like, that's the president, right? That's a very important distinction, is like, he's also considered like the leader of like Shia militant groups like all over West Asia, right? So that's like the relationship, is like his job is to safeguard the health of the revolution. You know, it's every single one takes a different like kind of like tact with how they do that. Khomeini was like very hands-on, very hardline, and he was, you know, leading Iran through the Iran-Iraq War, which started right after the revolution. Imam Khamenei was like a bit more hands-off, guiding line, like a spiritual leader for the people, like there to keep like the country together and to like help set high-level priorities, but to let like the democratic process kind of like drive the more like the details of national development. We'll see what Mujtaba like chooses, right? Like that's going to be, I think, like an interesting. I mean, he's a hardliner, and it's like during a war of existential like survival, so we can assume he's going to be a little bit more hands-on than his father, but we don't know for sure, right? Like that's only going to be like clear over time.
And then my third question is, you said that both Israel and the United States were expecting this to be a quick war, and sort of expecting the structure of the country to fracture after he was killed. Do you think that this is because of the long-term propagandizing of Iran as an authoritarian, like highly hierarchical structure where they sort of fall for their own propaganda?
I think a bit, for sure. I think that's part of it. Like, and you know, we're going to talk about protests here in a bit, because I think protests are a big part of like understanding Iran. Like, you know, they viewed some signs of internal dissent, of like disagreements with government policies. Like, I'll tell you straight up, like I don't know if there's any Iranians in the room, like we love to complain. Like we are like the biggest complainers on earth. Like we will complain about everything. Like nothing's ever good enough. Like, you know, that's like just how Iranians are, right? Like, and I think like a lot of these internal issues, like the economic protests that started in January and then were like hijacked by Mossad, like we'll talk about that a little bit. Like it led them to believe that these people were like straight up like anti-regime, right? And that's like, I think that's like where a little bit of that confusion happens. So we'll get to that in a bit. Yeah, go ahead.
So kind of off of that, I was gonna ask like, what is the role of the president in Iran right now essentially like defunct because it's wartime? And I know that, I mean, it's not like confirmed, but Israel like probably definitely caused that helicopter crash that killed the other president because they view this one as more favorable to Western interests. And like, is that their belief? Is that necessarily having validity? And like, is that even relevant anymore because of this one?
Yeah, I think like what you're alluding to is like this reformist faction in Iran versus like the principlist faction. I'm gonna try to go super quick. We are like running a little late on time, but I'll try to answer your question pretty quickly. If you look at like CIA policy papers and like the things that the Obama administration was talking about, they liked the reformist parties, right? Pezeshkian, Rouhani, Mousavi, Khatami, like these are the names that like were more pro-Western inside of Iran. And they actually traced their lineage back to like the Islamic Revolution, to like the students who took over the embassy. And this group of like leftist Islamists who were like a bit more like soft towards socialism, when the Soviet Union fell, their ideological base started to shift and they started attending universities in Europe, right? Like Pezeshkian went to university in like the West. Rouhani, Khatami, like these people like went to university at Oxford, and like almost everyone in the Iranian government has like 2 PhDs. Like that's like one of the funny things about like the Iranian government structure. It's like a bunch of like nerds and like poets and stuff. So to be honest, like if I was an American policymaker, that was the winning strategy. Over time, like transforming the Iranian state into something that was a bit more like accepting of the West, that would like allow like the like invasion of liberalism into like the psyche of like the Iranian people. And yeah, I think that helicopter crash, like there's a lot of, I think the ideal, let's put it this way, if they could have picked anyone they wanted, it might have been somebody like Hassan Rouhani, who was like a reformist. Like that's my genuine belief, but now that's internal Iranian politics, and we can debate about that all day. I'm gonna move us along. Let's talk about protests really quick. So what drives the perception of protests? I think like, you know, there was that one recently in January, but I think even like the more like spicy one to talk about would be like Women Like Freedom that happened in 2022. So I have a question, like just because we see a protest happen, for example, like we have protests here, like there's a No Kings protest happening at the end of March. Could you look at all the No Kings people and be like, yep, they want to overthrow the American regime? Would that be an accurate like statement?
Absolutely not.
Right? But maybe they have problems with Trump, with the current administration, with specific policies. I think that's something that's like the classic like thing that happens with like depictions of like Iranian protests. the protests that happened in January around economic issues were actually like a lot of it were anti-reformist protests, like neoliberal protests for the first few days. They were spun into these anti-regime protests, and then the Mossad agents like jumped in. And I have like this quote from the Mossad Farsi account. It says, "Let's come out to the streets together. The time has come. We are with you, not just from afar and verbally. We are with you in the field as well." John Bolton, Trump said, like, we're here, we're going to support you. You know, you have these like Western-funded news outlets that get millions and millions of dollars of funding from the National Endowment of Democracy. And it creates this like hysteria where like even the Iranian people, protesting is a healthy part of any like civic society, right? If you live in a civic society and you have an issue with a government policy, you go protest. And that's what happened for the first few days of the protests. The Iranian government made some major policy changes to their subsidy policies, to their like dollar fixed like rate policies. Like there was a lot of things that happened as a response to those protests because they were coming from the Bazari class, like the people in the bazaars, who were like one of like a powerful group within Iran. Like that's where that protest really started in Tehran. There was also lots of protests that happen in Iran all the time that are like labor protests. Oil workers in Khuzestan, all sorts of like protests like that are actually like done pretty peacefully. Negotiations happen. Whether like they're completely listened to and like those policies are enacted, like there's a lot of internal struggle and class struggle within Iran, and like that's true of any society. Like any socialist country in general will have like class struggle, right? So it's impossible to have that normal sort of political process if every time you go to like ask something of your government, the Mossad agents are going to come out and BBC Persian's going to like talk about regime change and like all the crazy diaspora and like the West is going to like go nuts. Like, so that's like where we get to this concept of like color revolution. Does anyone know what a color revolution is? Quick, let's go. Yeah, go ahead.
It's like a organic. Well, okay, not organic, but there are some specific issues among the people, and then the imperialists come and hijack it, and then kind of enact regime change. Maybe.
Exactly. Regime change from the outside. So I think it's really important for us like to understand like it's a tried and true playbook. You can go read policy papers by Western think tanks and they'll tell you like first we enact sanctions, then we take like a little issue, we blow it up big, we put our like operatives on the ground, we amplify it on Voice of America or BBC Persian or whatever. And they do this over and over again in all these different countries, right? Like the Hong Kong protests, was it 6 years ago that were happening? Like very similar story. And it's just, you know, you can sound like a conspiracy theorist for pointing it out, but then you just go read the actual policy papers of like the American regime and they tell you like exactly what they're doing. And they're kind of counting on you to not be like educated enough to like go look into it. So I think it's really important to like think about that, to think about the way language is used to demonize like the Iranian government or just other governments around the world. Even the term regime is like a highly racialized term, right? Like nobody ever talks about the British regime, even though like Prince Andrew's a pedophile who was on Epstein's island, right? Like, no one talks about like the French regime, even though like they banned hijab in France and like imprisoned people for speaking out against Zionism, or German regime, or you know, God forbid the freaking American or Israeli regimes, right? Like you don't find those terms used there. Terms like mullah, like that's supposed to like denote that like we're talking about a subhuman species, right? They're not as good as like us white Westerners. Like decapitation, like it's an animal that you kill by decapitation. Like this language is so, because it enacts this sort of like parasympathetic response in like white Westerners or in like the white Western society that like, you know, kind of just eases them into the racialized like fantasies that like allow like imperialism to like thrive. I think it's really important to realize like when you're being played with like that, you know? Yeah.
I just want to go to your second point. Like, what are the accounts? Because I think that's what separates a protest from, you know, an organized one like No Kings versus if they were actively shooting and killing people on the streets. At least that's the perception I've heard for what's been going on in Iran. Like, what's the disconnect there?
I think the disconnect, especially with those things, is like when it goes from an organic protest to a regime change, like called a revolution operation. In Iran, like all the time, like I'll give you actually this is I wasn't even going to share this, but I'll share like a personal story. My cousin's in Tehran. They were driving. It was like my niece's birthday. They were driving to go get ice cream for her birthday, like after they went out to dinner, and all of a sudden, like they get caught in the middle of this like protest. A group of armed gunmen hide behind their car and start shooting at government forces from behind their car. Fire is exchanged, like bullets are shot, like windows are shot out. They all made it out okay. But it's like when those weapons are introduced into the society, when you have Mossad operatives who are telling you that they're in the field, right? And you see even like videos of people getting like shot by like the protesters and then like they get held up as a martyr. Oh, this was killed by the regime. Like, I think it's basically domestic terrorism, right? Like that's like the dividing line between like where like the Iranian government, and this is true of any government, there's not a government on earth that if you burn down a fire station, if you burn down a hospital, if you like destroy ambulances, and funny enough, like a lot of the targets of these protests were like the same institutions that are protecting people now during the war, like hospitals and ambulances and stuff like that. Like any government on earth is going to crack down on it. That's the role of a state. That's the role of a government, like, is to like defend its own stability, right? And you know, we can argue all we want about like, oh, it's carceral, it's like this or that, but it's sort of like a scientific fact that that's what a government or a state is in any country around the world. And Lenin tells us like the class character of a state is like a determining factor in like what that state does. So the police in like a revolutionary society, or like even if we want to like go a level down, like the police in Cuba are fundamentally different than like the police in like Miami, right? Or the police in like Los Angeles, you know? So I think that's like the important thing to understand. It's like, okay, yeah, like maybe there were cases where the Iranian government has been heavy-handed in protests, like where they felt like there was like threats of regime change and they cracked down pretty hard. But it's also like, how can you know like were these protests like organic once like the terrorism comes out and like the Mossad operatives come out and that violence starts to happen like on a street level? Like, I think it's important to like, for these protests specifically, like, you know, this atrocity propaganda of like 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 people dead is like so ludicrous when you just look logically at it, right? Like, you're telling me that like the Israelis killed how many, like what's the final death toll? Does anyone know like what the reported death toll in Gaza is? 60 or 70,000, and that's over 3 years of genocide, right? And that's probably undercounted because they destroyed all of like the ministries of health and stuff. But in 2 days, the Iranian government killed 30,000 people, and there's no mass graves, and like the Iranian government puts out this list and says, these are the 2,000 people that died. These are the ones that we believe were martyrs, and these are the ones that we identified as foreign operatives. There's like no opposition group has been able to produce a list of 20,000 names, right? So it's just like these things get so like this atrocity propaganda, whether it's like the Nayab's testimony in like Iraq, like during the Gulf War, where like, oh, we pulled babies out of like, they pulled babies out of the incubators and stabbed them, or Hamas beheaded a bunch of babies, or I think Trump said that the Iranians were beheading babies recently. They like reused that one. Like it's just important, like it plays on our emotions, and it's like when you say like, oh, that's not true, or you question it, it puts you all of a sudden in the position, it's like, oh, are you a genocide denier?
Do you like killing babies?
Do you like killing babies, you know? They did the same thing with the Soviet Union, then China, and also like with the Cultural Revolution and the Holodomor and all those things. Like it's part of their playbook, you know? Like you go read their policy papers, this is what they do, right? So it's like from the outside in, like looking in, like all we can do is like keep imperialism out of it and let the organic political process take its place. The Iranian people already overthrew one dictator, right? They've had more revolutions in the last 50 years than anyone in the West has had in 200 years. If they were really living under an authoritarian dictatorship, they've shown that they have the power to like take care of it themselves. Are you about to raise your hand? Oh, okay. So I think it's important also, like, I'm gonna push us along a little bit. Like, think about what voices are amplified and which voices aren't. Like,
Iranian community. We have our Macy Jenkins live in Westwood following the demonstration that's happening there. Is it joyful? Mostly, Macy.
It mostly is, Kathy. Dozens of people gathered in front of the federal building earlier this afternoon to do what I would only call as a celebration. Some of them have gone home, but there are still pockets here. The chanting going back and forth between thank you to Trump and USA, and then Javid Shah, which means long live the king. It's a chant used to protest the Islamic Republic and to celebrate and possibly usher in a constitutional monarchy.
Relatives of Iranians who fled during the 1979 revolution.
Center Iranian voices, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Where is this?
Westwood?
Westwood what?
LA.
LA, okay.
It's like the heartland of like our version of Miami Cubans, you know? Tehran-Angeles. Great food, horrible people. You know, versus like this video I'm about to show you, we're not going to look at the whole thing. Look at how many people are in this crowd. This was after the protests in January. And it's just city after city. Massive crowds of people coming out and supporting them. And this has been true like ever since the 2009 color revolution attempts. Every time we have this instability in Iran, women like freedom, there were protests in January, the protests like, 2009, like the Green Revolution, quote unquote, like, you always see these massive pro-government protests that happen afterwards, but they're never covered in the Western media, right? I think that's like part of the propaganda we have to like understand too. It's about 9 o'clock, so you guys are free to go. We have like the space actually for a little bit longer. I'm gonna go like 15 more minutes. Are you guys cool with it? Yeah. CLP folks? Okay. But you guys are free to leave. Like, we're technically towards the end of the event here, but there's probably about 15 more minutes of content. Yeah, of course. So real quick, I want to talk about this concept of like hybrid warfare. I I would ask you guys like what it is, but I'm gonna push us along a little bit. Like this is the idea, like the U.S. like staging color revolutions, like enacting sanctions, really trying to like mess up a country using terrorism and all these like concepts without declaring like an actual kinetic war, which is what we have now in Iran. Sanctions are like a huge part of it. And I think it's important to understand like that's like really like before we get into the Iran war right now, like that's the state of relationships between the US and Iran. It's like everything we talked about plus this like hybrid warfare. I want to talk about Al-Aqsa flood. Do you guys know what Al-Aqsa flood was? Like what that refers to? Does anyone want to give us a quick? October 7th, right? The operation where Hamas like broke out of the concentration camp and showed the Israelis that they could bleed. We have to think, if we're political militants, if we're revolutionaries, if we're political organizers and we're thinking about how to like free our own people here, we have to really put ourselves in the shoes of these decision makers in Palestine and what caused them to do October 7th? What made them think that? What was happening before October 7th? The Arab regimes, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the normalization, the Abraham Accords.
Exactly.
Slow genocide.
The slow genocide, the Abraham Accords, right? Iran was starving slowly, Palestine was slowly getting chopped up, the West Bank was getting more occupied every single year, and the Arab regimes were starting this process of normalizing with the Zionist entity. How has Al-Aqsa flood changed that?
We've seen like global solidarity protests with Palestine and a pushing farther afield of what the narrative allows for in terms of what is necessary in order to free the Palestinian people.
Yep. And with that came the fact that normalization is dead, right? These Arab countries cannot normalize with Israel now because their populations would never allow it. The quiet process of normalization, like the true like viciousness of the Israeli state, of the Zionist state, is like now bared its teeth where all of us can see it. So many more people now understand what Zionism is and what the Israeli state is than we did before. And so that has qualitatively changed the situation, and that was just several hundred young orphans who took like the decision into their own hands to change things, and that's really important to think about. I'll kind of go over this too. Like I think a big aspect of this, like we talk about like capitalism, foreign policy, it's important to understand there's an ideology behind this too. Like, do you guys know who this guy is? Like the greasy gentleman, the Crusader cross tattoos? Does anyone know who he is?
Oh, that's the guy who was running in Maine, right?
No, the Pete Hegseth.
Pete Hegseth, our Secretary of War. That's him.
That's Pete Hegseth.
So he's got the Crusader tattoos. Can anyone read that tattoo there? Does anyone know what that says? Right below it. Kafir. What does kafir mean?
It's like, I don't even know what the translation is.
Yeah.
Yeah, when people say infidel.
Infidel,
Yeah.
A racialized
And there's like a whole like controversy that came out. This is from military.com, from like a Western, like mouthpiece. Like, like the Iran war is this like biblical mandate. Like commanders are telling like troops over there, like we're gonna bring the end times. Armageddon is coming. Like we are fighting the Iranians. Like the Israelis are talking about this like Amalek prophecy. If we kill enough Iranians, the end times are gonna come, right? And like Huckabee is like saying the same thing. So it's important to understand like there's like a big white supremacist, like Judeo-Christian supremacist aspect that like underlines all of this. Like even if like the stuff they use to like trick well-meaning people into supporting this kind of stuff, like the liberal humanism and like women's rights and that kind of language, underlying it is this. It's the same fascist ideology that underwrote like all of settler colonialism like throughout history. So we're gonna do like a strategic analysis. This is gonna be like the last kind of thing we talk about. So I think it's important now, like we're militants, we want to understand the Iran war, like what's going on. We have to understand, like we have to do a dialectic analysis, which means we like look at both sides and how they interact with each other. So first, like what are the strategic objectives from the US perspective? Go ahead and shout them out. What is the US trying to do in Iran? Control oil, secure oil. Regime change, he was talking about that.
Secure, or get rid of one of the primary enemies of Israel.
Yep.
Secure global shipping.
Secure global shipping, yeah, exactly. Everyone knows what this area is, the Strait of Hormuz.
Our favorite.
Next time you fill up your gas, you'll think about what this place is. What are the strategic objectives from the Islamic Republic perspective? Survival?
War of attrition.
War of attrition?
Economic gain.
Economic gain, right? Sanctions. Get rid of sanctions, get rid of the sanctions regime.
Eliminate Western spheres of influence.
Eliminate Western spheres of influence. Like you guys see all these like red arrows. These are strikes that the Iranians have carried out in these countries. What are these places they're striking? They're not just striking civilian areas in Saudi Arabia and UAE, are they? Like what are they hitting? US military bases. West Asia, since Sykes-Picot, and especially since the ascendancy of the US empire, is under like a Western occupation. These military regimes are the enablers of Zionism. You're talking about trillions of dollars in military hardware that is getting wiped out by Iranian missiles right now. So what material tools and leverage does each side possess to accomplish these goals? Somebody mentioned asymmetric warfare. On the Iranian side, what are the main weapons the Iranians have at their disposal to make the West hurt?
Trade interdiction.
Trade? Yeah.
Trade interdiction, yeah.
Yep. Missiles? Drones? Yep. What about the Western regimes? What do they use?
Propaganda.
Yeah, the propaganda apparatus, that's a big one. What about hardware? What are they using? Their navy, right? Aircraft carriers. I think air power. The U.S. empire is built on air power, primarily. And because Iran is a mountainous terrain, I don't know if you people know this, Iran is one of the most mountainous countries on earth. They're not actually able to fly jets over Iran. Despite all the bluster, there's no credible reports of actually Iranian airspace being controlled by Israeli and American fighter jets. They're using what they call standoff munitions. These are high value, precision guided munitions. They fly over Iraq or they fly over Syria. They let go of these munitions and they turn around and fly back. Through the process of the Syrian Revolution and also through the downfall of Saddam, much of the air defenses that existed in those countries were destroyed by Israel. So the principle of asymmetric warfare, really to understand it, is Iran spends $20,000 on a missile that costs $3 million to shoot down. They overwhelm these Western defense systems. They destroy these THAAD radars, and over time, this war of attrition bleeds the empire dry. That is the fundamental strategy of Iran. And you can read Che Guevara, you can read Mao Zedong. These concepts of guerrilla warfare are consistent, but this is the modern version of it, right? I'm gonna move this along. So what are the key factors to understand who's gonna win? How is this coming out? How do we understand for the next few weeks? What are we looking at? One, can the Islamic Republic retain the full support and unity of its people and eliminate the threat of separatist and internal saboteur elements? During the 12-day war, a lot of Iranian infrastructure was taken out by internal saboteurs, Mossad agents and whatnot. Two, can the Islamic Republic retain a structure of governance and avoid destabilization of the state? Three, can the U.S. Zionist entity protect its key assets and maintain its occupation of West Asia? Four, can the U.S. Zionist entity degrade the Islamic Republic and its allies' military capabilities, and especially Islamic Republic air defense capabilities? And five, can the Islamic Republic exercise full control over the Strait of Hormuz and bring the global economy to its knees? We're going to talk about each of those quickly. Point one. I don't know if you guys have seen any of these videos on social media, and I'm not going to play all of them. So they're basically showing them videos of Iranians protesting in the US, and these people are disgusted. They're these people are protesting the killing of their own countrymen. If you look at some of these other videos that I'll pull up, you have many videos Iranian. This is from today. You guys see that in the background, that big mushroom cloud? They bombed the protest, and people are marching towards where the bombs dropped. How do you defeat a people like that? The Vietnamese, there's that famous Ho Chi Minh quote, you will kill 10 of us and we'll kill one of you, but eventually you'll tire of it first. That's the logic that the Iranian people are operating under right now. These people are not scared. And even later on, you'll see somebody is holding up a bloody flag here. Actually, I'll play this one. That's Ali Larijani. That's the head of the Security Council with minimum security around him, surrounded by people on the streets. Tell me what would happen if Trump had one security guard and walked down the mission right now.
That's Drake and Kendrick. The thing about Drake gets a bunch of people saying hi to him, but he has to walk around with bodyguards.
Yeah, exactly. Kendrick can go walk around Compton however he wants, and nobody bothers him. So these are different videos, and you'll see this woman, for example, is a liberal. She has her hair out. She's not the typical support base of the Islamic regime, but she's there supporting the government. And that's one thing to understand about Iranians. Whatever internal issues we have, that sense of nationalism, that 4,000-year-old sense of nationalism runs so deep that the second Iranians are attacked, they rally around the flag. And we saw this last time. We see it again. One of the dumbest things the U.S. could have done again was launch a direct attack on Iran. The unity of the people is almost a given at this point. We've seen no signs of any instability of the people and protesting against the government. There's been massive crowds of hundreds of thousands of people in every major city for most of the last 2 weeks. So one, they did not accomplish their goal of destabilizing getting the Iranian people out in the streets against the government. Two, the Iranian state is stable. These are all basically the main leaders.
Iran's
of the Iranian
leadership
state.
is in no better shape.
This is from today.
Desperate and hiding, they've gone underground. Coward. That's what rats do.
That's Pezeshkian, surrounded by people taking selfies.
Not so supreme leader is wounded and likely disfigured. He put out a statement yesterday.
This guy's walking down the street taking selfies with people.
And licking his fingers. He's like, out of the way, he's ugly.
And essentially every power player in like the Iranian government, like here's the Ministry of Culture, she's out in like with the people, like all of these like main people are out in the streets right now. The government is functioning. Like there is no like dissolution of the Iranian government despite what you're hearing in Western media.
I'm sure that to many people it's news to them that there are women in Iran's government.
You know, Iran had a woman vice president in 1995, and we didn't have one until Kamala Harris. And not to say there's not gender oppression and there's not more work that needs to be done to integrate like women into the power structure and all these things, but come on, like glass houses, guys. Like, look at our current government, how they feel about women. Point 3, key Zionist assets cannot be defended. These are images from like U.S. military bases showing the destruction of THAAD radars. There's been a struggle going on in Korea. I don't know if we have any Koreans in the audience. For decades, they've been trying to get rid of this THAAD radar in this village in Korea because of its poisoning of the locals. It's making them a target for potential attacks from like the DPRK or China in the event of a war. And just like that, because Iran has like destroyed 6 THAAD systems out of the 8 in existence in the Middle East, they're taking this one from Korea and moving it to the Middle East. And take it from Marco Rubio himself. This is like a rare moment of honesty from like the Secretary of State. He says they are producing by some estimates over 100 of these missiles a month. Compare that to the 6 or 7 interceptors that can be built a month in the United States. They can build 100 of these a month, not to mention thousands of one-way attack drones they also have. They've been doing this for a very long time. By the way, they've been doing it under sanction. You see the attacks they're conducting right now. They're attacking airports, they're attacking hotels, they're hitting not just military bases, they're attacking our embassies directly. The fact that he's being that honest about it means like they're pretty in deep shit when it comes to like their production capacity. And China has now in the last 6 months passed export controls over rare earth metals that are necessary for these high precision munitions. They're interceptor missiles, they're standoff munitions. You know, you can say whatever you want about China, but those like rare earth like restrictions and also Russia's war in Ukraine has drained the West of its like defensive munitions, which is what the Iranians are benefiting from right now. And then 4, resistance capabilities show no signs of degradation yet. Hezbollah launched its largest ever salvo ever about 36 hours ago on Tel Aviv, 200 rockets. They shot down 3 F-15s, which the US conveniently says were all friendly fire. If you believe that, I have like a beach house in Idaho I can sell you. Another tanker was just shot down today by the Iraqi resistance in Iraq. They haven't even gotten to the Iranian airspace yet and they're getting like shot down. Again, it was involved in an incident with 2 aircraft and it went down and 19 people died and it burst into a heap of flames in the middle of the sky. You know, that kind of thing just happens. Yeah, go ahead.
And 5 were just, refuel tankers were just hit too in Saudi Arabia. Yep.
Yeah, sitting on the airfield, right? And Iran has like basically turned Tel Aviv into a laboratory for testing cluster munitions.
Israel. Iran's cluster warhead ballistic missile detonates in the sky, releasing dozens of smaller submunitions that fan out and descend like falling stars.
You know, if it was happening to anyone but the Israelis, we'd probably feel bad about it. And then point 5, Iran decides who may pass through the Strait of Hormuz. These are oil prices, and this little dip was the largest release of strategic oil reserves across the Western world in history. And that's all it did. They released, what was it? I don't forget the exact number, you might know it, but hundreds of billions of barrels, basically.
That
Like
was the amount they released after the Russia-Ukraine war started. They released and then it rebounded within a single day.
Exactly. They're hitting ships that are trying to go. This is like the movement traffic. And now Iran like recently has announced, like, here's some conditions for you to go through the Strait of Hormuz. 1, throw out your US and Israeli ambassadors. 2, if you sell your oil in RMB, in the Chinese yuan. The petrodollar is like the cornerstone of the United States empire, right? It's what allows us to print money whenever we go through recessions. It's what allows us to buy insane amounts of military hardware. And that is like fundamentally being eroded by like this new kind of world order that like the Iranians and the Chinese are like building. So, you know, China may not be like militarily intervening, but through their satellite support, through like the erosion of like the petrodollar, like this is trends that are like trending positively if you're an Iranian strategy maker. So, like the last thing to really talk about, like there's still some remaining escalations. Like the U.S., you know, unable to like accomplish their military objectives. They bomb schools, they bomb hospitals, they bomb innocent people to try to pull leverage. Same thing they did in Gaza when they couldn't defeat Hamas. Same thing they do to Hezbollah when they can't defeat them. They bomb Da'iya in Lebanon. Ground terror attacks from ethnic separatist groups. I think they tried. There was like talk about the Kurds like a few weeks ago, or a few days ago. Boots on the ground. There's 25,000 Marines now headed to like to Iran. And did anyone catch the interview with Iran's foreign minister when he was asked about that?
Yeah, please.
We are waiting for them. We are waiting for them.
Wait, did they up the number? Because I saw an interview with Hegseth this morning where he said it was only 2 kids. It's since been jumped up
Is it 2,500 or? Yeah. Okay, I misspoke. Yeah, sorry, 2,500. Yeah. And then they can keep bombing civilian and like infrastructure, oil infrastructure. Iran bombs the oil infrastructure in these Gulf states. In Israel, boom, oil is going to be $300 a barrel, and everything we own, everything we want to buy is more expensive, right? And that's the thing too, is like the byproducts of this war, when it boomerangs back to us, is going to affect working class people, right? It's the working class person who suddenly can't afford to be spending $100 more on gas per month, right? It's the working class person whose food getting much more expensive is really going to affect them, and we have to kind of be prepared for that as organizers here in like the Imperial Corps. On Iran's side, like Ansar Allah still hasn't been activated. I think they just put out a statement today that they will be joining at a future date, but they haven't like shut down the Red Sea yet. They haven't targeted like Israeli or Arab civilian infrastructure very much. And the Palestinian resistance, like, while it has a bit more breathing room, like hasn't truly reactivated yet, you know, in the sense that like taking the fight back to the Zionists in Gaza. So there's all these things that are kind of like hanging out there, and we're just gonna have to wait and see what happens. So I think last things like for us to think about, we're right at the end here. One, how can we insulate ourselves and our communities from the US like psychological warfare? I hope that's one thing you guys have taken from this is like, when you're in your communities, like even if you don't agree with everything I just said today, you don't agree with my analysis, at least like having that thirst for knowledge and that nuance. So when you're like in an affinity group or your organizing group and you hear something about like the totalitarian regime or whatnot, like you can at least provide a bit more context, get people to think more critically about what they're hearing on the news, and even like being more critical about what we absorb. Like that sense of defeatism that like these like, you know, Western news outlets try to instill in us is something that like in our own struggles we have to combat too, right? And we're gonna learn that by like starting here, right? Starting with these struggles that are happening overseas. Two is like to think about what does an Iranian victory look like for the region, for the world, and those of us here? What happens in a world where we can't print US dollars anymore? When all these things that I was just talking about, prices go up, the welfare state collapses, the first people that are gonna get like cut off the island are gonna be brown and black people here in the US, right? Fascism is gonna explode even more than it already has. Like these are all things, these are eventualities. Like looking at how this Iran thing is going, like I'm telling you, it's coming. It's coming. Like we're gonna be at risk, our communities are gonna be at risk even more than they already are, and you need to be prepared for that. And that's like the third point. Like we have certain responsibilities to the people. If the people over there are willing to give their lives to die for the against fighting against capitalism and imperialism, we need to get serious about the sacrifices we're willing to make and what we're willing to do for the people in our communities. And I think that's like a really important point here. So that's about it. I have like an ending video we can watch, but I think we're pretty close to the end of time. If you guys have any last questions or anything, I'll put this video on while we clean up and get out of here. Yeah. For sure. I think like to keep up with the news right now, I really like The Cradle. If you guys follow like thecradle.co, like they put out great material every single day, like following like the day-to-day of the war. I think if you want to understand like the Iranian society, like I would read Gharb Zadigi by Jalal Ali Ahmad. And we have some of these reading recommendations up on our on our Instagram if you guys check that out. Al Mayadeen English is like another good one. You can listen to Iranian news, you know, take it with a grain of salt, it's from Iran, but like Press TV, like Tehran Times, like these like outlets are going to give you like some pretty good like perspectives. And of the other side, like you have to understand everything has a bias and a class character, and you have to think critically through it. But that's a way to at least get some sources that are running counter to some of the other things you might be hearing. Yeah, of course. Anything else? Cool. Well, the turnout was amazing tonight, guys. This is the kind of talk I don't think I could have done like 5 years ago. Like things have changed so much because of Al-Aqsa flood that we can even like openly discuss these types of things. And understand like Iranian society has a lot of contradictions. Like I have my own critiques of the government, of issues we have in Iran, but when it comes to me talking to a bunch of Westerners and like in this type of setting, like we need to be united against this war, and we need to be united like, you know, for the liberation and decolonization of like West Asia. And that's all I have for you.